I'm Walter Cruttenden with the Binary Research Institute. We're on Campus Drive near the University of California, Irvine. The Binary Research Institute, where I work, is focused on the cause and consequences of solar system motion. You know, the ancients were just brilliant sky watchers. They had beautiful black skies and they could see the slightest movements of the heavens. And there's things that they picked up that I think we're missing nowadays, not only because we don't watch the sky as much anymore, but because we rely on instruments that sort of take away some of the natural phenomena that you might see. And so I am particularly interested in cycles that are driven by celestial motion. So for example, the Earth spins on its axis, gives you the cycle of day and night, has a profound effect on us. You know, we go literally from conscious to subconscious every day. People don't realize that that one little spin affects our consciousness because our bodies are adapted to the electromagnetic spectrum from the sun. Likewise, the Earth goes around the sun, creates a cycle of seasons, causes trillions of life forms to spring out of the ground, grow, give their fruit, decay, billions more to spawn, migrate, hibernate, things like this. So if there is a third cycle, which the ancients talked about, Plato called the Great Year, then you could also expect that it would have a profound effect. And indeed, we find there's over 40 ancient cultures that talk about this great year, this Yuga Cycle, this rise and fall of the ages with alternating dark and golden periods. And we believe that that is driven by a celestial motion, just as the two minor cycles are driven by celestial motions. But we've sort of forgotten this big cycle. You know, we assume that it's just a wobble of the Earth, and therefore it has no effect anymore, and that's what we're missing.
So we're talking about a phenomenon that is distinct from the precession of the equinoxes, and it involves a cycle that revolves around another central point somewhere in the cosmos, then, somewhere other than the sun.
No, actually we're talking about the precession of the equinoxes, but it has been misdiagnosed. We assume, because of the paradigm set by Copernicus and Newton, that it's due to a wobbling of the Earth, the gravity in the sun and the moon acting on the oblate Earth. And that was because when Copernicus talked about it, he didn't know the solar system moved. Heck, he was just starting to tell us that the Earth moved. And when Newton talked about it, they didn't know the solar system moved. And same thing with some people that followed him. It's only in recent years that we realize the solar system moves, but by then the models had been cast, and so there's now 1,200 components that go in to try to explain something we call the precession of the equinox, the stars moving across the sky retrograde at 50 arc seconds per year. That's 30 degrees per 2,000 years. But it is just a misdiagnosis. It's actually caused by the solar system gently moving through space. And indeed, we can show that with a mathematical model, just using solar system motion, we can predict the precession rate 41 times more accurately than the current lunisolar model. Yeah, and it's a little bit of knowledge that's been lost. The ancient cultures talked about the motion of the heavens. I don't know if you've read Hamlet's Mill by Giorgio de Santillana and Heather Foundation. Brilliant book, and they document over 200 myths from all these different cultures, from Nordic to Mediterranean to Polynesian, and Chinese, Indian, etc. And they find it amazing that so many ancient cultures are talking about not just different periods, but they're tying it to the position of the constellations relative to the solstice or the equinox. So they didn't always call it the precession of the equinox, but it's clear that they're just as much aware of this long cycle as we are aware that, there's a different constellation overhead each month as the Earth goes around the sun.
So is your take on that then that all of these ancients spontaneously developed this great astronomical knowledge, or would you favour the parent civilization theory?
I favor the Yuga Cycle, or what the Greeks would call this great year. And the Greeks broke it into the Iron, Bronze, Silver, and Golden Age, and the Indians broke it into the Kali Yuga, Dwapara Yuga, Treta Yuga, Satya Yuga. But it means the same thing. And the Hopis called it different worlds, the Mayan call it different suns, et cetera, et cetera. They're all talking about this cycle that man goes through. And just as we go through the cycle of the seasons, and it's cold and it's hot, and the Earth gives of itself, or it's hard to live at certain times. Likewise, in this cycle, there are periods that are of low consciousness, and periods of higher consciousness.
The Dark Ages and the Renaissance.
Exactly. Yeah. As a matter of fact, this concept of history, the great year, this cyclical concept, was the dominant way to look at history up until the Christian era, who then came along and said things are only 6,000 years old, and that's that. And of course, that's been sort of supplicated by the theory of evolution. But I can accept a theory of evolution over a long, long period of time, but it doesn't mean that there's not cycles within there. And the Indians, from Manu to Sri Yukteswar to Paramahansa Yogananda, they give great detail on this. And so we're trying to investigate how much of it is true. How much can we figure out with our science today?
And of course, it echoes that everything else in nature, of course, is cyclical.
Very much so, yeah. And just because there's a cycle when consciousness is low doesn't mean we all have to wallow in it. There are people that had brilliant thoughts in the Dark Ages, and but it is easier to expand your consciousness when the wind's at your back, so to speak. And I think the wind's at our back right now, if you look at all the writings on these teachings. That we came out of the Dark Ages, we had a renaissance, which means rebirth of the cycle. And consciousness is expanding now, and yes, there's a ton of problems on Earth, but we're figuring them out, and I'm very much an optimist.
Let me draw the conversation towards megaliths, which is obviously the guiding theme throughout this weekend particularly. Why do you suppose the ancients went to such trouble to build these monuments?
I'm not absolutely certain, why different megaliths were built the way they were, but I'm just stunned by the number of megalithic sites around the world, and the amount of work that went into building them. And so it's indicative that they have some great importance. And it could be, we've had a physicist by the name of John Deering speak at one of our conferences, which is sort of the Megalithomania of the Americas, if you will, that these were done to sort of hang on to some of the beneficial influences of the higher ages. And it's been found that certain sites, agriculture seems to be improved around them. And so it could very well be that ancients realized they're coming down from the higher ages. They all talked about this cycle. And they want to do something to try to hang on to some of the positive energies of the Earth. And that's one idea. Another idea is another fellow that presented at our conference, John Burke. He wrote Seed of Knowledge, Stone of Plenty. And he took a magnetometer to Avebury and found that all the stones are aligned by polarity. Stones, when they come out of the ground, they're naturally formed. They'll have a positive side and a negative side because the Earth's a big magnet. Whatever side faced the North Pole will be positive, and whatever side faced the South Pole will be negative. But when you start moving them around, you don't really know nowadays without a magnetometer which is the positive side and which is the negative side. And yet somehow, some way, ancients understood to align these things so the positive side always faces the next stone in line. And it really looks similar to like the Large Hadron Collider in Switzerland. Those are done with supermagnets, but to accelerate a particle. And so I'm not saying that Avebury is a particle accelerator, but I'm saying that they knew something about these subtle energies that they felt had a purpose, and it's up to us to discover what it is.
And of course, we as human bioelectric organisms, magnetism has a great effect on us too.
Yes, very much so. Also, this particular configuration in henges, if you stir something or get something going in a certain direction, you can do it with just wind and dust and create a little vortex. If you a stick in water, swirl it around, you create a little whirlpool there. Well, they're effectively doing it with subtle energies by aligning these rocks the way they are. So there's some sort of magnetic vortex created there, and I don't know if that's part of the purpose of these things, but it sure makes you wonder, doesn't it?
Why do you think that these sites have such a powerful effect on people today?
I'm not 100% certain, but it could be that there are energies that we need that are beneficial to our growth that the Earth isn't giving us in every spot, and so we're attracted to places where these energies are enhanced. For example, many people do yoga. Kriya Yoga is one form of changing your own internal energy, and it could be that there are sites that have a similar type of effect on a human just by visiting them. I'm not certain.
Do you personally have a favorite place? Is there a megalithic site that is your personal favorite?
It's sort of a natural megalithic site, if you will, and that's Sedona, Arizona. Fantastic spires of red rock, thousands of feet high in some cases. And there's just this resonant quality about it. And so, yeah, I love to go to Sedona. And they have what they call these vortexes, and I like to visit them.
To talk about the man-made megaliths again for a moment, do you believe that the builders were leaving messages for antecedents for us today?
Yeah, and maybe it's not a message that is real specific about something we should do, but it's a knowledge, or it's a benefit to us today. And in that respect, yeah, I do think they're trying to help us out.
And have you got any thoughts on how they were built?
I don't. It's hard enough to move a 50-ton stone like they have at Stonehenge, and then you start to think about some of the 1,000-ton stones or 1,500-ton stones they've found in places like Lebanon. It just boggles the mind. I have no idea. Especially if we have this paradigm that it's a primitive culture. Primitive cultures would use something that's easy to move, not something that's difficult to move.
So would you say then that tends to be an indicator that's more advanced technology than we currently give the ancients credit for was at play?
Yes, yeah. I'm 100% convinced that this idea of a great year, the higher ages and lower ages, is real. It's driven by celestial motion, not anything spooky or weird, but just like this, seasons of the year and the cycles of the day. And yeah, I think they did have higher knowledge. I was just at the British Museum the other day, and I always love to go and look at the oldest stuff. And ideally start maybe 3,000 or 4,000 years old and go back from there. And it's just outstanding in the whole Egyptian, Mesopotamian lines that we went through. The coolest, neatest, most symmetrical, most artistic, even some of the most whimsical things are done earlier. And then you see the the craftsmanship sort of go down as you move to the Dark Age. And in fact, look at Egypt's at its height at the beginning, and it's essentially a nomadic culture by the Dark Ages. Same thing with Mesopotamia, Sumer, Akkad, Babylon. Same thing with Indus Valley, Harappa, Mohenjo-daro. They have this knowledge of using uniform bricks, indoor plumbing, municipal sewer systems, and it completely goes away, not just in Indian valleys, but all over the world.
Why do you think then that there's an argument that perhaps the chronology for the ascent of man and the rise of civilization, do you think there's an argument then that perhaps we don't have that quite right?
I don't think we have it right. I think, we tend to think that modern stuff, if you can have cell phones and computers and gizmos like that this is a sign of tremendous cleverness. And yet we're creating all these problems for ourselves. If you ask half the population, they would like to get back to a more natural setting. And I think the ancients figured that out and did live more in tune with the earth.
And I'm thinking particularly, I mean, why do you think that archaeologists, the orthodox archaeology, orthodox academe, why do you suppose that they continue to claim that the monuments are not as old as in fact that they now seem to be? There's a lot of emerging evidence that our chronology, our dating of these edifices is quite a way out. Why do you suppose that is?
I'm not certain of the dating on most of the sites. I don't have a great desire to doubt the standard archaeological spectrum until I see something like Göbekli Tepe come along, or Nabta Playa. Because I was taught as a kid, civilization's 5,000 years old. Before that, we're hunter-gatherers, and we couldn't do anything. And then when Göbekli comes along, and it's twice that age, and these are huge, 20-ton pillars carved, then it really causes you to wonder whether we've been getting the right story all the time.
I agree entirely. Why do you suppose the celestial bodies, the sun and the moon and the stars, were so important to megalith builders? Because they clearly were. What's your take on that? Why do you think it were?
Well, I think ancient man, really operated with a higher intelligence, and it's a time when science and sacredness is not pulled apart like it is right now. And what could be more sacred than the thing that created us, the sun, which we all depend on, the stars, the universe. If you look at the old mythologies, one of the most common themes is the myth of invariance, or the problem of the one and the many. All these old mythologies talk about God wanted to create, and so he made copies of himself, or he split himself into the many. And then of course, we get stuck there, and then we're trying to figure out how to get back through the hero myths and journeys and things. And I think they saw things much more as a whole, and were aware that they're part of this oneness, versus right now, some religions don't even allow that there's a oneness.
Why do you suppose archaeologists and academic institutions are so resistant to the idea of incorporating new information, new data as it comes along? Because the essence of science, of course, is that you are constantly modifying your ideas on the basis of new material as it comes to you. And yet archaeology appears to be very resistant to that. Why do you think that might be?
Well, I don't think there's a big conspiracy going on. I just think that change is difficult for a lot of people, and especially when you're in an academic setting where peer review is required. And so if somebody has written a paper saying that something is 3,000 years old and was done by a very primitive culture, and somebody else comes along that has some information that no, it's 5,000 years old, and they really had some pretty advanced techniques here. And yet that second person has to get his work reviewed or previewed by the first person. It's almost as if the paradigm doesn't change until the first person dies off. And so I forget who said it, but science progresses one death at a time.
I like that. How could we be sure, though, what the ancients were doing when there are no actual records surviving from the dates of a lot of the constructions of these sites?
I don't think we are certain at this time. We're still very close to the Dark Ages. If this precession cycle, roughly 24,000 years, 12,000 up, 12,000 down, and we've just come out of the Dark Ages, less than 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago, really, the Renaissance, then I don't think we have the ability to understand higher cultures, particularly if you start to understand the way the Indians, Greeks talk about these higher cultures, what they knew. For example, there's the story of Babel, and it's roughly 3,000 BC or so. Mankind begins building towers, ziggurats, things like that. About that time, God confuses the tongues, But there's all this myth and folklore that before that time, mankind spoke with one tongue. He communed with nature. He could talk to animals. Hesiod talks about this. The earth gave freely of itself. The Indians would say, that's true. You didn't need writing until lower ages. And then as we go back up again and get into the ascending Yuga, that telepathy and clairvoyance will once again be common knowledge in the next Yuga.
And that's also reflected, I think, in one of the concepts I encountered recently about how, for instance, Egyptian hieroglyphs are less a language per se, more than they are ideograms. So the idea being that 2 or 3 little pictures can convey an entire concept.
It sure looks that way, doesn't it? Yes, exactly. And we do that in some cases, with stop signs and things like that. We're coming out with more and more universal systems, but it'll probably be a few thousand years before we're telepathic as a people.
We've noticed that megalithic sites are very similar in a lot of respects all over the world, whether that be in construction methods or in terms of how they reflect the heavens, or how they are aligned to celestial events like equinoxes and solstices. Why do you think that might be?
I think these sites have a purpose that we haven't yet discovered, and again, if you sort of hear the stories about the higher ages, they could be used, I hate to say it, but even as places for transportation or communication. And I know that no archaeologist would buy that right now. But supposedly in the lowest material age, we can only we think things are very solid material. We're just human bodies. We have no knowledge of finer forces. And then in the electrical age, which we've just come into here with the Renaissance, we're supposed to discover finer forces, the Indians would say. And sure enough, we discover electricity, magnetism, that things are made out of molecules, molecules are made out of atoms, and atoms have almost nothing in them. It's space. It could well be that, the other stories then that you begin to annihilate space later in this age, and it looks like we're doing it because you can fly so quickly from point to point nowadays, you can talk so quickly over a cell phone. Then if the stories are true about being able to annihilate time in a higher age, who knows what that means? I mean, that's kind of cool stuff.
Lastly, I just wanted to touch on earth energies. There seems to be growing evidence that these are not, as was once thought, something mythical. They do actually exist. The earth has fields of resonance, it has magnetic energies, and possibly spiritual emanations too, that we are starting to be able to, perhaps again, tune into. Do you think there's a way in which these could start to be mapped scientifically and recorded?
I think we can map or record some of the things. If it's magnetism, we understand ferromagnetism, so we can record that and map that, as John did at Avebury and others have done. To the degree it's electromagnetism, we can begin to discover that. But if there's even more subtle things, I'm not sure that we're there yet as a people. And I really wouldn't separate spiritual into a different category. I think that's just has to do with us, our understanding.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think this is one of the big reasons that science doesn't get it a lot of the time, is because it has intentionally divorced the empathic, the emotional, the feeling from the perhaps more harder scienced left-brainedness, if you like.
Yes.
And as long as the two are separated, they're never going to get the whole picture.
Right. And that's a quality of the lower ages. And fortunately, we are evolving in this cycle, and so hopefully we'll get to the point where we'll figure it out before we destroy everything. Megalithomania.